Hi everyone! The learning outcomes for this unit, which is Unit 9, we are going to discover and assess the causes, events, and effects of World War I on the world. And it really was a world war with global reaching arms because it wasn't just between European superpowers, it also included colonies across the globe. The time frame that we are going to be discussing is 1914 through 1919, and some of the main topics that we will be including in this discussion include politics, empires, and how some of them disintegrated, the rise and increase in a tremendous way of nationalism, pride for one's own nation or people, and how propaganda was used to make the war seem bigger than it was and to make the enemy seem like an extraordinary threat, and how societies were altered. And all of this is surrounding World War I. Our IDs, our map IDs, and our timeline. Okay, our focus question. What were the major far-reaching consequences of World War I in both time and place? In other words, what did World War I affect or cause in the future? Now, include in your answer an explanation of the main causes and features of World War I and an assessment of the three primary sources that were assigned for this unit. And that includes excerpts from the Treaty of Versailles, which talk about the consequences that Germany would have to pay for being blamed for the war, and Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. This was a speech that he gave to discuss some of the big goals, some of his desires for what he wanted to see happen after World War I to bring freedom and democracy to the world. And excerpts from Donald Fraser's My Daily Journal. This, I think, is really hard to read because it's so sad and disturbing to really try to picture what he went through and what soldiers like him went through in World War I, which some of us can relate to. Some people are soldiers and military, and if you are a part of that, I greatly thank you, because you deal with things that I could never deal with. There are also lots of images, primary source images in the PowerPoint and in this lecture that you will be able to view and feel free to include in your assessment. And I just wanted to go over this because it's important to think about this question before we review the history here, so that you can think about what the main causes were, what the main features were, and what the main consequences were of World War I. And of course, if you decide to write on this focus question, you need to include the 5 W's: who, what, where, when, why, and how, and why important for world history. And there isn't just one who. There isn't just one how or why. So think about that. And of course, citations are needed for all examples. Okay, here we go. And here's just a really quick review of social Darwinism. The idea is of the survival of the strongest. Now, again, this is a really messed up version of Darwin's theory of evolution, but the idea behind this became might equals right. And with this is white man's burden. And in the 19th century, in the late 1800s, it became a national race with empire building, which we've seen a lot of with the Ottoman Empire, which was starting to fade but still growing, the British Empire, which became the biggest empire, the German and French and Japanese empires, which were all growing. And this also, of course, led to an industrial race to build the most everything, the best goods, the most goods, and of course with goods that includes arms. So it definitely became an arms race, and arms as in armament, as in weaponry. And we see with World War I in particular an extraordinary development of weaponry, from small rifles to machine guns and all these really brilliant and horrifying new technologies. So in talking about World War I, it's important to discuss some key terms, including nationalism. And the time frame that we're dealing with when we talk about the rise of nationalism is starting in the early 1800s, in particular when Napoleon in the late 1700s and early 1800s goes into other parts of Europe and takes over. And people really, in a lot of ways, appreciate some of the reforms that he provides, more equality and more social services, more education, more roads, but they really hate the idea of being controlled by a different group of people, by the French. So pushing back against the French helps push forward other European nationalisms, pride in other in their own country as opposed to in being part of France. So nationalism as a definition would be the sentiment or the cultural tradition or the social movements and a close connection which focuses on pride for a nation or a people. It's the way people think about themselves and the group that they consider themselves to be part of, either a nation or a people. There are some nations that have not always had a home. The Jews, for example, Jewish people would be considered the Jewish nation or would consider themselves a Jewish nation, even though they had been sort of displaced for a few thousand years until 1948, until after World War II, and their Jewish state was created, the state of Israel, the modern state of Israel, should I say. And nationalism in wars is kind of interesting. It's not just pride in us and saying we are the best. It leads to we are better than the other, quote unquote other. And that is any enemy, any even competition, people or nations that are even allies, we are still better than the other. And that makes us seem prettier and them seem less so, uglier, not as smart, etc. And the goal in nationalism in wars is to love us and hate them, and they, the enemy, are considered evil. And we use things like propaganda to promote the idea that the enemy is an evil entity. They are evil people, they are horrible, they're murderers, they're villains. We create images and promote images in mass media. With World War I, we're talking about newspapers and billboards and stamps and pamphlets that are posted and passed out to people. And that also includes public school education. People go to school and go to church and go to other parts of places where they can get information, and they are being fed the idea that the enemies are not just enemies who want other things in a political sense. They are an evil entity and they want to destroy us. And that happens throughout every war, but World War I really sees a lot of propaganda in the form of things that are published because we have access to things like newspapers that are very inexpensive. And so propaganda about the enemy, negative information about the enemy, is spread pretty quickly and far. So the causes of World War I. I've heard people say, oh, it was because this guy, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was killed. That was the kind of the head of the match catching fire. There were so many other really, really big reasons that caused World War I. So if you do decide to write on this focus question, make sure that you think more broadly than one guy being killed. Because really, there's no way that that could have sparked a war without a world war without all of these other really huge things. One, European global empires. Global is highlighted for a reason. Empires are, again, an entity that has an extraordinary amount of power. And in this case, we're dealing with European superpowers. Germany, France, Spain, Italy, Portugal, the Dutch, and all of these superpowers have colonies in other parts of the world. In India, the British control India, and there's parts of the East that are under control of American and European powers, and the Americas are very much invested with both economic and social and political interests in Europe. So we really are dealing with a global empire, European powers spread across the globe. In addition, we have a European internal rivalry, and this competition has been perpetuated for now several hundred years, and it just kind of continues. There are divisions in the past. People say, okay, we're no longer going to fight each other, and it turns into a competition, especially with the Industrial Revolution. There's less warring and more competition to create bigger and better things. But now what we're dealing with is an internal rivalry to create bigger and better weapons, to make sure that we have more power over them. And that's the mentality that happens across Europe at this time and right prior. And then again, nationalisms. The Serbians and the Slavs, or the Slavic-speaking people, want independence from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And what's kind of interesting is that the Archduke of Austro-Hungary, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Austria and Hungary, Franz Ferdinand, he ends up being killed by Bosnian Serbs on June 28th, 1914. It's kind of unfortunate to think about because he really was interested in providing more power to the Serbians and Slavs by splitting the Austro-Hungarian Empire into a third and creating a third entity, so the Serbians and the Slavic speakers would have influence, a greater amount of influence, rather than just between Austria and Hungary. Unfortunately for everyone, the Serbians, the Bosnian Serbs, didn't consider that to be enough, and even if that had passed, chances are he would have been killed by someone else in the Austrian or Hungarian sections because they didn't want to give up any power. So it was a really challenging place for this poor guy to be in. There was a few assassination attempts, and they got him on the second round, and his pregnant wife Sophie, and it was very dramatic. The first time the bomb missed, hit other people, and they went to the hospital to visit the people who had been hit by the extremists, and that's when they were killed. And just to look at a quick glance at the empires and the influences that Europeans have had across the world. So the Russian Empire is on top up here, and they have a lot of influence. European colonies are smothering Africa, plus India and Southeast Asia, which we already knew. The British dominions, I like the way they call it, include not just Great Britain up here and the Union of South Africa down here, but also Australia and New Zealand and Canada. And the British Empire is really, really powerful at this time. Europeans also have some influence here in South America. And South America and North America are gleaned off of independent European-derived states. So Spanish mainly and Portuguese, plus the British, have influences over several hundred years in the Americas. And then in the East, the Arabian Peninsula, in the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire and China, all are semi-colonial regions with a lot of influence in Europe as well. Or should I say the Europeans have a lot of influence in those territories. So again, causes of World War I, it's really an accident waiting to happen. And I think the biggest reason is inflexible diplomatic alliances. What does this mean? Let's take a quick look. So the Western Allies, or the group that called themselves the Allies, include Russia, who had an alliance to defend Serbia when the Serbian killed the Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Then the war was declared against Serbia, so Russia stepped in to defend Serbia, and France stepped in to defend Russia. And there was England stepped in to defend France, and it was really more of a verbal agreement to defend France, but really England had to defend Belgium, which also had been attacked, plus all of the colonies. Plus, eventually Japan joined in. Italy started off on the opposition, and because Italy said, I will defend Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the case of a defensive war, Italy called them as attackers and decided to switch side to the Allied side. The United States declared itself neutral and refused to take part in the war all the way until 1917, until almost the very end of the war. And what finally got the United States in the war was Germany's refusal to treat waters as neutral territory. And the United States was shipping goods to France and to England. So even though the United States claimed to be neutral, they were definitely on the side of the Allied powers and were providing a lot in the form of food and munitions and support without the ground troops to the Allied powers, especially to France and England. So eventually Germany, with their U-boats, their underwater boats, they refused to say that the waters were neutral territory, and any ship that were to come through would be hit. Then the United States' goods were being threatened, and when you threaten American products, you get war. That's exactly how it worked. And the Western Allies fought against what are called the Central Powers, and that included Germany and their colonies, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, plus a few other allies. And here's that crazy map that I was telling you about. The green countries are the Allied powers. They're also called the Triple Entente, and that's including the European superpowers and their colonies and their allies. The main players, Britain, France, Russia, and Japan, plus Italy and the United States and all of their colonies, like India. That was a really big one. India sent a lot of troops over because they were forced to by the British. The orange colors are the Central Powers, also called the Triple Alliance. I think that gets a little confusing, the Triple Entente versus the Triple Alliance, so I say the Allied Powers and the Central Powers. And their allies, Germany, Austro-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. And only the gray states remained neutral, even though many of the gray states ended up supplying goods to other parts of the either Allied or Central Powers, most of the time to the Allied powers. Here's a closer look of Europe. The Allied powers are in purple and the Central Powers are in orange. Okay, so war propaganda, or war propaganda machine, and social militarism. This is another really big reason that provoked World War I. And we're dealing with a mass media age. Again, newspapers, publications, pamphlets, billboards, and a lot of information is being passed on to people quickly and far. And there's a great promotion of the idea of fear and hate of the other, including really horrible images. We'll look at a few. There was also conscription. Conscription is the forced joining of the military. And almost all nations in Europe had forced conscription. If you were of the age, a male around 16 plus years old, you would be forced into the military. In all countries except for Britain, there was conscription. And the British government even provided white feathers to women to give to their men as a sign of cowardice. And if you were a man and didn't join the war effort voluntarily, you were considered to be cowardly. So even without forced conscription, there was a social stigma against not joining the total war effort to ensure that the proper powers would win. There were also uniforms and parades. In parades, we would have political leaders, a government official in a military uniform, and this would just go to promote the idea of social militarism. Anyone who wanted to run for government office had to be promoting nationalism and had to be promoting the idea that he was strong. I say he because only he's were running for political office at the time. So if a man were to be running for office, he would put don a military uniform. Even if he was never in the military himself, he would find a military uniform, put it on, and parade in public. All of this stuff led to popular support for war, and this also meant that the war would become a total war. Total war includes everyone and everything. Men, women, and children. Women make children, and children grow up to become men or soldiers in war. And so it wasn't just male soldiers who were the targets. It was anywhere that a person could be on the side of the enemy was considered a legitimate aim. And that included hospitals and schools, and that included animals. Farms feed people who are military men, so farms become targets. Horses become targets. A very kind of unfortunate outcome of this war is animals that are harmed. And then lastly, as far as the social militarism and war propaganda goes, is ready-made war plans. People had an idea, governments had ideas as to how, if a war were to happen, how they wanted it to end up. And this kind of reminds me of if a team is going to play, like a sports team is going to play against a different sports team, they have plans. You guys are going to be the offense and you're going to circle around here, and the defense, you're going to do man-on defense or zone defense or whatever it is, and that's how we're going to win. And in this case, you always want to make the first move because that means you will be in control. You don't want the other side to flip the coin and get the first kick because then you won't be in control. So being in control is really important because then you can fulfill your plans. So this kind of leads to trigger-happy nations that are just on the verge of pressing a button to go to war. They are ready to go. And the best scenario for all of these nations with their ready-made war plans is to be the ones to start the war. Not exactly a good thing for peace lovers. Just a few images here. This one says, beat back the Hun with Liberty bonds. A bond is something that you purchase from a government, and you basically are giving the government money to use now, and in 10 years, say, or however long the bond is for, in 10 years you'll get back your money plus a little bit of interest, and if you wait longer and lend that money to the government for longer, then you'll get back more money later. And so this image is saying, beat back the Hun with Liberty bonds. You should buy Liberty bonds so that we can destroy the Hun. Now the Hun is a derogatory term for Germans, and it goes back to this Eastern European leader, Attila the Hun, who was extremely violent and just massacred enemies. And the Huns wore spiked helmets, and the Germans wore spiked helmets. So that there was a connection there. The German Kaiser Wilhelm II, in a speech before the Germans went to fight in the Opium Wars in China, Kaiser Wilhelm said to his men, we're going to be like the Huns, we're going to take no prisoners, kill everybody, leave no one, there should be no sympathy for the enemy, so that the Chinese know to never mess with the Germans again, to never look askance at a German again. And so the German Kaiser kind of gave this name to the Germans, himself. And the British got a hold of this speech and said, look at how brutal these crazy Germans are. They're so evil. They're going to kill everybody, men, women, and children. We have to destroy them. And so you would see a lot of images like this one as basically propaganda brochures in newspapers posted around bus stops, etc., to show, or not bus stops, but stops where people would go, trolleys, and where people would see this image. It's a horrible, evil looking image, and it's dark and it's brooding, and he's got a bloody knife that's attached to perhaps a bayonet, I'm not sure, and the buildings in the background are smashed, and he's bloody with brooding eyes, and you see the pokey part of his helmet, which is connected to that very strong and scary leader, Attila the Hun. So this is definitely a propaganda piece here. Here's another one. Destroy this mad brute. Enlist in the U.S. Army. And you see this mad brute, this gorilla figure, holding a bat that says culture with a K, which kind of is a throw towards German culture, and he's landing on America. He's stepping on America, and he's holding poor Lady Liberty, and he's undressing her even more than she already probably was undressed, and she's screaming and crying, and there's nothing she can do, and you see across the waters there's Europe in shambles. And this is what's going to happen if the mad brute, if militarism of German powers is not destroyed now. So you young men need to enlist in the U.S. Army to protect America from the German culture. Pretty powerful propaganda here. And again, he's wearing the Hun hat, the helmet with the spike on top. Okay, a few more reasons for the causes of World War I. Industrial militarism. And that is the idea that all industries have to go towards the war effort, which is again a promotion of the idea that war is total war and it includes everything. Perhaps before a manufacturing facility created airplanes, now it's going to be turned to create airplanes for the war effort. And perhaps before a place was making pots and pans, and instead now they're going to be making tools for the war effort. So even manufacturing facilities become part of that total war effort. Everyone is involved to win, and that also means that everyone is involved to be killed by the enemy. Everyone can be a target here. And with new industrial militarism, new war technologies are developed. A lot of new war technologies are created. And that's not just weaponry, bigger and better guns that can shoot extremely great numbers of bullets, but communication technologies. We'll look at a few in a second. And then lastly, naval technologies. Naval warfare becomes an extremely important player in World War I. So a few images here. The Gatling gun becomes a machine gun. So we go from 11 bullets per minute to a machine gun that, according to this image, says that more than 7,000 rounds could be fired by 1916 per minute, which is extraordinary. And it would take 4 people to man, because someone would need to feed the bullets and someone would need to crank the thing to make the bullets fire. And so it took 4 people to run this insane machine gun that could shoot several thousand bullets per minute. I think really it was more like 4,000 bullets a minute as opposed to 7,000, but either way, that's an extraordinary number and really changes the game. Zeppelins, or dirigibles, otherwise known as blimps, were used for bombing, and they would go over a city and just drop bombs without discriminating against whether it was a school or a hospital or a military facility. Again, this is total war, and that's all that matters. Tanks. Tanks are a really big machine that is fortified with strong metal and doesn't have wheels. It has this big round sort of one wheel that can climb over all sorts of territory. Really intimidating, really loud, really scary at first. But if they were to be hit by a bomb of some sort, then it's just dead space, and the people inside of the tanks become targets pretty quickly. And aside from being something to hide behind in no man's land, which is just an open space with no trees, no holes, nowhere to hide, the tanks didn't really do very much aside from intimidate people in the beginning of the war effort when they were first created. And then barbed wire. Down here there's an image of barbed wire, and this was really an important part of trench warfare. And we'll talk about that in a second. But barbed wire is basically wires that have little pokey things on them. You don't want to prick yourself on it because at this time there is not enough things like antibiotics to go around. So if you are poked by some barbed wire, you can just get a little scratch and end up dying from an infection. And then chemical warfare. We'll look more at this in just a second. Some communication technologies. A telegraph provided the ability to communicate over long distance, and Morse created Morse code, so it sounded like beep 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 beep, and that somehow was an alphabetical order that created words and people understood it. And this was important for passing secret codes, and eventually they were deciphered, so other codes needed to be created, but really important for the war effort to create this telegraph. Railroads, really important because they provide not just the movement of people, but the movement of munitions or ammunitions, guns, and food supplies for the soldiers. And planes were also an important part of the war effort, mainly for reconnaissance missions. Reconnaissance is to gather information. They would look down to see troop movement. There was very little bombing, but there was some strafing, some low-flying gunners that would go down and fly really low and shoot their guns. But for the most part, planes at this time were used just for information gathering, for reconnaissance missions. And then the naval competition. Again, European empires were competing for trade routes. The UK, Britain versus Germany. And this is really important. This is a dreadnought, a huge gunner that had tanks, not tanks, they had cannons and a lot of interesting sonar information here. And they attempted to block the German ships from moving and from getting goods. We'll look at a map in a second to show how landlocked Germany is, and so getting goods by water is really an important part when you're surrounded by enemies. But the British did a really good job with these dreadnoughts, these humongous ships, to ensure that the Germans didn't have the capacity to sail past them. So what does Germany do? They create U-boats or underwater boats or submarines. And with those submarines, they conducted sabotage, and they ended up breaking the blockade of these dreadnoughts because they could go underneath the water. And sabotage includes bombings of other ships and of land, and they were able to go right underneath the ships that were floating on the water to go and trade with other countries that they were allied with. What's interesting about the submarines is that they kept being sunk by the British and the Allied powers, and the Germans would just lift the submarine out of the water and patch up holes, fill it again, and send it on its merry way. And this happened repeatedly. I would not want to have been a military man for the Germans working on a submarine, that's for sure. But the submarines really helped provide Germany with power during this war. And there's Germany in red, and you can see that being surrounded by enemies for the most part, especially on both sides, France and Poland, it was important for Germany to get water access. for goods and trade. Okay, so major consequences of the Great War. So we've talked about all the major causes, and now we're going to talk about the consequences, the ending. What happened after World War I ended? Well, one, it ends in a defeat of the Central Powers, and I put a question mark next to the defeat because there was sort of a surrender of those three major empires, the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the German Empire, plus their allies, the Bulgarians. And it ended in an armistice, meaning a sort of timeout. We're just going to press pause here for a few minutes. We're going to recoup our efforts, and we're going to come back to this war at another time. At least that was the belief of several people in those three empires that ended. So I put a question mark next to defeat because the Central Powers weren't fully defeated. They thought that there was more to come. And it formally ended with what is called the Paris Peace Treaty in early 1919. And the Paris Peace Treaty had a lot of implications for the future. We will talk about that in class. But basically, Germany was the one to receive most of the blame for this whole war, and Germany was supposed to pay reparations to help the Allied powers heal after the war effort, or after the war ended. And of course, Germany had also been destroyed, so having a destroyed country paying a lot of their gross national product, a lot of their money to other European nations and to the United States, that was really hard on Germany and on the German people. And I think that was a really big provocation for World War II because people blamed the Paris Peace Treaty as a main cause of why Germany eventually ended up creating World War II. So some of the other major consequences of the Great War of World War I were the surprises and horrors. One, it was considered a war of attrition. That means we want to kill the most people on the enemy or bleed the other dry. That was a saying that the Germans said of the French. And so it wasn't a matter of gaining territory or for some event to happen. It was, we're going to survive longer than them. We're going to kill more of them than they can kill of us. And having a war of attrition only leads to extraordinary numbers of dead people, and that's exactly what this war was. One example that shows that this was a war of attrition was the Somme, the Battle of the Somme, and from July through November of 1916. This was the first use of the tank, it makes it a little bit interesting, but look at these numbers of casualties. 200,000 French people, 500,000 Germans, and 420,000 British troops were either killed or severely injured within a few-month period. Within one day, 58,000 troops were lost, and a third of that was killed. And these numbers are kind of insane for a battle, not a war, a battle. And this basically meant that a whole young generation of these French, German, and British men were lost just in this one battle. And what was the outcome? The British gained about 10 kilometers, which is less than 7 miles of land. So we're not talking about major gains in any way. It's just a matter of killing more of the enemy. Very, very unfortunate. And this is just one example of one battle during World War I. Again, it was total war. The economy and all of the opposition, all of the other, was considered enemy. This image is of a Belgian city, and you can see parts of remaining buildings. Everything was annihilated. Schools, churches, hospitals, everything counted as enemy because it was really considered total war. We're talking 10 million soldiers killed and 7 million civilians were killed, plus another 20 million were wounded, plus 1 million horses were killed because horses bring things like goods and people, and therefore horses are the enemy. Most horses were killed by chemical warfare. Anthrax in particular was the drug of choice that people used to infect horses with a very deadly disease. Plus, cities and farms were completely destroyed. And this Belgian city is one example. A lot of Europe looked like this, including a lot of Germany. And with the Paris Peace Treaty, Germany looking like this was supposed to help rebuild other European entities, other European states, which, as you can imagine, was a little bit of a hardship for Germany. There's a close-up. Excuse me. This is a casualty clearing station, and this is France in 1916. This is where people who were wounded or had died would come to get a little bit of help and maybe get sent to a hospital or get sent somewhere else in Europe that's supposed to be safe. People in casualty clearing stations were open targets, and a lot of times they would have flybys of planes with low gunners that would go and shoot up these people. This is where a lot of women came to volunteer as nurses, and there is no sanitation, there's no running water, everything is filthy, and your chances of survival here are slim, even if you just have a fairly minor wound, because there's no antibiotics. People who are having surgery done, the doctors don't wash their hands, they don't wipe off the blades that they're using. There's gangrene, people get basically limbs that need to be cut off because of a minor infection, and then they end up dying or at least surviving with very little full bodies intact. Very few people had full bodies intact. Additional consequences of the Great War under surprises and horrors include sabotage. In the past, in major war efforts, there was this idea of gentleman's methods, and things like sabotage was considered immoral and, generally speaking, wasn't performed. However, all is fair in love and war, or should we say nothing is fair in love and war. If it is a matter of survival, then you do what you need to do. This isn't a game of chess where even if you lose the game, you'll go home to your families. In this case, if you lose, you die. And so some people attempted to sabotage the enemy to ensure their side would win. In this case, we're talking about German Americans who, in America, cut wires, bombed railroads, and derailed trains, and also poisoned horses with anthrax. Anthrax is a disease-causing organism that quickly multiplies in a living body, and some 3,000 horses had been infected, sent overseas to Europe, and then spread the anthrax disease to both soldiers and other horses. And a lot of life was taken because of this. And then other poisons were used, such as tear gas and mustard gas, and chlorine in addition to anthrax. And these are all very painful, very morally wrong. Most people would consider these things to be morally wrong, and caused a lot of damage to millions of people, plus farmland, plus animals. Here are some images of people who had suffered from chemical weaponry. Tear gas causes severe eye, respiratory, and skin irritation, meaning it's really hard to breathe. It burns your eyes and it burns your skin. It causes a lot of pain. People end up throwing up because they can't deal with it, and in some cases it even leads to permanent blindness. So that's a really big problem. And then mustard gas, on the right side, you see this poor guy who has these bubbles on his hands and around his neck, and that basically is what happens to skin, and when you breathe it in, that's what happens to your lungs. A person has 5 lobes in their lungs and can survive with just a few of them, but if enough of those lobes get burnt, then you cannot breathe properly and then you end up dying. A lot of people ended up dying. This is what mustard gas looks like. It's sprayed down a line, usually when it's a windy day, so that it'll be carried farther across a field. It was first used by German troops in 1915, and overall during World War I, 800,000 people and animals were harmed by that. But in this case, we're just talking about humans. Down here on the right, you can see dogs wearing gas masks and people wearing gas masks. This was more of a mental attempt to help people feel comfortable about being out in the open where chemical warfare was being used. A lot of times these gas masks did not work. Sometimes the valves didn't open and people would suffocate to death. And other times they just leaked and it was not very useful. And then the picture on top shows people who had been burned by mustard gas pretty severely. Their skin clearly is extremely affected, and chances are they're having trouble breathing because it got into their lung lobes when they breathed it in. Oh, and there's one more lovely picture of what mustard gas looks like when it hits your hand or skin. One more image. Inescapable. 1 million horses overall during World War I were killed by anthrax. Again, that disease-causing organism, it quickly multiplies in a living body, and about 3,000 horses were poisoned to begin with in America, shipped overseas, and then that spread. A few more of the surprises and horrors of World War I are trench warfare. And trench warfare is this hole, like a tunnel that's dug out, and it doesn't have a roof. And the situation there is completely brutal. And that is because you're kind of almost an open target to random stray bullets that can be shot in. There aren't direct shots from the enemy because you're in a tunnel, so to speak, a headless tunnel. It doesn't have a roof, but many times stray bullets would land in. And then the seasons were really harsh. In Europe, in the summer, it could be really dry and dusty and hot. In the winter, winters are horribly painful. There are no rooms to go change in, so if it were to rain or snow and someone would get wet, they would have to stay in that wet clothing. The tunnels, the trenches, eventually are filled with all sorts of bodily fluids because there's nowhere to go. There are no restrooms. And if someone gets shot, they just stay there until they turn to mush and people step on their comrades or enemies. It's an extremely brutal experience. And right outside of the trenches is what is called no man's land, because no man can survive there. It's just open field, nothing to hide behind or in, and there's no way that people could really survive crossing no man's land. And then in some instances, tunnels were dug underneath the enemy. In one occasion, for example, a 5-mile tunnel was dug underneath German troops, and then it was exploded, and some 10,000 Germans were buried alive and died. This is a picture of a trench. As you can see, the walls are just mud. It's raining. They're sitting there with shovels trying to keep the trenches open and clean, but it's virtually impossible if it's raining to stop the mud from dripping down. Another image of trenches. And this is a drawing, and I think sometimes drawings convey even more power than a photograph can. And in this case, you see troops that have been killed are in the trenches, and the others all look dejected. Their heads are down, their shoulders are slumped, they're crawling over snow, and everything is a sad mess. These are some images of no man's land, and you can see why it's called no man's land, because there's nothing to hide behind. So if a sniper is there watching, anyone to cross in this path would be a very easy target. And it's protected with barbed wire to prevent the enemy from jumping into trenches on on the opposition side, but there's only so much that barbed wire can do, and oftentimes it would catch people on its own side. One more image, you see the trench on one side and the guys hiding behind the barbed wire on the other. So the primary source document that we are reading is by Donald Fraser, who was a Canadian expeditionary, a soldier in the Canadian military for the Allied forces, and he wrote My Daily Journal, and we are reading excerpts from his journal. And be forewarned that when you read it, it's, I find, extremely challenging because it's so emotive and poignant, very sad and emotional, and it really kind of helps us understand what life was like, what soldiers experienced during World War I on the front lines, in the trenches, with all of the horrors of war that he dealt with. And World War I is especially gory because it was so much hand-to-hand combat in a lot of ways, except for with guns. So pay attention to the way he describes a few things. First of all, the enemy, in this case the Germans, and he calls them names like Huns. There are connections to history and to the idea that the enemy are kind of guerrilla-like barbarians, animalistic. They're not real humans. But then towards the end of his writing, he begins to see the Germans as brothers, as sons, as fathers, and he realizes that they are human just like he is and just following orders like he is. And he also describes his own military leadership. As you will quickly see, it's very sad for him and upsetting to see how these leaders who win awards are not brave. They hide in places where they will be kept safe. They don't really cross the battle lines, and they have food and warm clothing, and they can change out of wet gear, and they can go back to base and be protected and safe, whereas he and his men are kind of in the opposite situation. They don't have the choice to disappear when it gets scary, and yet the military leadership are the ones who end up receiving awards, and it's really disappointing for him to see that, to experience that. Fraser also described the supplies that he received or didn't receive. They did get enough food to eat, but it was always the same thing at certain times. So they would get chunks of food, but never a variety, and it wasn't proper balanced meals or nutritious. And things like rum, it was never in enough supply, and rum is really important because it helps circulate the blood when it's cold. It can be used as a disinfectant, and it helps people kind of forget about their woes, to put it in simple terms. So the fact that they weren't even supplied with these basic needs was kind of important. In addition, bullets. They sometimes didn't have enough bullets. That's kind of intense to think about. And he kind of shows how all of these things affected his mentality. Pretty horrifying stuff. Okay, another of the major consequences of the Great War: widespread disillusionment in Europe. Europeans are coming out of a sort of Enlightenment period with the idea of progress and reason and equality and the idea to care for other people. And within Europe, there are millions of people who have been slaughtered by other Europeans. And how can Europeans be the enlightened civil people if they are the ones mass murdering each other? So a lot of people sort of turned away from the idea that Europeans were the highest ranking in the world, the most developed, the most civilized, the most progressive and wonderful, because clearly they were not following proper Enlightenment philosophies. Women in the Great War. During World War I, women really came into the workforce in great numbers, as all the young men were being conscripted into armies and taken away to fight on the front lines. Women had to step up and take over at home, and there were also women who were fighting alongside the men, not so much with guns, but as nurses and as caretakers. So some even became spies, some at home were making artillery, and many of those women who were working in ammunitions were poisoned with TNT and mustard gas. Their hair turned yellow, their skin turned orange. There were a lot of challenges for women working in these positions. And then on the front lines, women did have to deal with artillery fire. They were being shot at, especially as nurses trying to help wounded soldiers on the front line. So women definitely had a big important role in this war for the first time in all of human history since the agricultural revolution some 6,000 years prior. After the Great War, after World War I ends, so starting in the 1920s really, conservatives kind of like the idea of women going back home. You did your great nationalistic work by coming into the workforce while men were away, but now our soldiers are returning and they need jobs. If you have a job, you are taking a job away from a soldier. So a lot of conservatives wanted women to go back home and get out of the workforce. Of course, some women were like, I don't think so. This is kind of fun and I like being independent and making money. But in general, because women were seen as secondary money makers, women were not paid equally, and this, of course, has continued through today. In France, Mother's Day was created. That's where we get Mother's Day from. It's coming up. Mother's Day is really important across many European nations and the United States because mothers are an important and integral part of society. But it was created in France to promote the idea of women being homemakers. Women should go back home from the workforce and go make babies. And part of that is just to repopulate the huge chunk of people who were killed during World War I. And another reason was to make future soldiers. So that was women's role, at least in France, and that idea spread through other parts of the Western world. Additionally, the 20s was the jazz age, and women became flappers. They had short hair and short skirts, sleeveless dresses, and they went to nightclubs, and they had control of their own sexuality, and they went drinking and dancing, and a lot of course, conservatives were freaking out over this. That is immoral and wrong, and women need to be protected and in the home. But women started to become more liberated. Additionally, the push for suffrage, for the right to vote, and women's rights was pushed more and more, and finally, it wasn't until after World War I that women gained the right to vote in most European nations and in the United States as well. Here's a picture of women welders during World War I, taking a man's job because the men were away at war and needed these things to be created, so women stepped up and worked in former man's positions. And again, after the war was over, these women were expected by most people to go back home, though some people didn't. These are VADs, voluntary age detachments, and these are women who worked as nurses and cooks and kitchen maids and clerks and housemaids and ward maids and laundresses and motor drivers, etc. And all were urgently needed according to this ad. It's interesting to see how clean these women are, both in the picture and in the advertisement. In reality, there were no showers, there were no laundering facilities, and women who were on the field would be covered in all sorts of bodily functions and would not have a chance to go and clean themselves off, at least not on a regular basis. So their white outfits would be covered in many other colors. Women also acted as spies during World War I. This is one example, Mata Hari, this is her stage name, and after she grew to be of an age where as being a stage dancer was no longer profitable for her, it was said that she went and became a spy for Germany. She was caught by France and eventually lined up and shot with a firing squad. But that's just one example to show that women were also part of the war effort in a different way, as spies. A few more ads. This one says, sow the seeds of victory, plant and raise your own vegetables. Every garden is a munition plant, and the meaning of this is people are growing food to send overseas to their soldiers. And that means that people who are at home aren't having enough food, and there were rations where certain days you wouldn't eat certain foods. To save them, people were asked to save their fat from foods like bacon, and women were supposed to grow gardens to feed themselves and their community, and even maybe to send some food overseas. Another image, National Service Women's Land Army, Godspeed the Plow, and the woman who drives it. These again are man's jobs that women are stepping up to take during World War I because men are gone. So it says apply for enrollment forms at your nearest post office or employment exchange. And these are young women stepping up to do jobs that have been for thousands of years kept for men only. Okay, a few more of the consequences. Division of territories. We've already talked about this, but the Ottoman Empire ended up collapsing, and Turkey became a formal state, a formal nation. The mandate system was set up, and the mandate system is basically European powers, the British, French, plus Japanese, plus 4 others, who were to divide and control territories that were formerly part of the Ottoman Empire, the German Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So basically the territories are in the Middle East, Africa, and in South Asia. And mainly the British and French were the ones who ended up taking control over these territories. A new map was created in the Middle East. And again, these were held by mandates, but the new states of Syria, Iraq, and Transjordan are some examples of the new states that were created out of the Ottoman Empire. We'll look at a map in a moment. In the European East, national identity or cultural identity was pushed again with the belief and desire for self-determination to rule themselves in the European East. And you see new nations starting to come up as an important self-fulfilling prophecy with the desire to rule themselves. And it takes a long time. And then lastly, in this topic, the Armenian genocide happened in Turkey. We've already talked about this. The secular Sunnis, the young Turks, killed between 1 million and 1.5 million Armenians, Christians, because there was a belief that they were siding with the Allied powers, which chances are they weren't, but either way, this was definitely a horrible experience for Armenians. The Ottoman Empire. By 1914, it's just that dark orange territory, and all of the other territory is former Ottoman lands that had been lost over the 100 years prior. Territorial changes in Southwest Asia after World War I. The dotted purple line shows the League of Nations mandate starting in 1920. The bluish colors are British protectorates or British mandates, Egypt, Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, and several places in Africa and in the Middle East. And then The orange is the former Ottoman Empire prior to World War I. So you can see how much territory was taken away from the Ottoman Empire and how much was given to the British and other mandates, other Europeans. This is kind of an interesting map. It shows territory that was ceded by Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Russia in those top three colors, the green, yellow, and khaki colored. And then the British mandates are in orange, the French mandates are in purple down there, Syria and Lebanon, or what became Lebanon eventually. And then you see the underlined pink words are newly created states and mandates. So that's kind of interesting to look at all these new states that were created out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire, and ceded by Russia, so given up by Russia. One more map. European-controlled territories in the 20th century, Middle East. And the dates here are pretty interesting. Algeria did not become independent until 1962. The UK or Britain had the orange colors. Italy held Libya. Spain held some parts of Morocco. And then independent of European control were those few orange, pinkish states, Turkey, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. Iran gained independence from a different dynasty, and yeah, these are interesting dates to look at after World War I. It took really after World War II for most of these states to gain independence. Another of the major consequences of the Great War, during the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, that mandate system was set up, and the League of Nations was created. This was the idea of the American President Woodrow Wilson to have a whole bunch of nations come together and stand to prevent war in the future and to make the world safe for democracy. The problem with the League of Nations was that it was very weak and very ineffective. It was not supported by any military capacity. There was no army there, only economic sanctions. And economic sanctions can be useful, but generally speaking do not harm leads or heads of states. They only harm the majority of the people who are innocent. So that was a problem. Additionally, many of the League of Nations members who promised to join were late or didn't show up at all, and that includes the United States, because Congress did not allow the United States to join the League of Nations, even though it was Wilson's own idea. Additionally, the Treaty of Versailles was created, and this basically blamed Germany for World War I. And this led to Germany having to pay reparations. Germany had to pay for the rebuilding of Europe and all of the states that it caused problems in. And in 2010 were the last payments made. And that really had a big hit on Germany, especially prior to World War II. Once Hitler took power, the reparations were put on pause until after World War II. But then they were reinstated and didn't finish getting paid off until 2010, which is unreal to think about, almost 100 years. Additionally, the Treaty of Versailles said that Germany had to have a very limited military. They lost all of their colonies in Africa and in Asia. There was great humiliation, and all of those things combined, especially the humiliation, I think was a really big provocation for World War II. There were people who came into power in Germany who said, "We are not to blame, we are not paying these reparations, in fact we are going to go to war and take back what's ours." And namely, one of the head people who said that was Hitler. In addition to the lost colonies that were taken, the Rhineland was also taken in the end of World War I. Once there was an armistice between Germany and Allied powers, the Allied powers continued to push forward to take more land, and they ended up taking the Rhineland, which is German-speaking territory. And between that and the humiliation and the idea of reparations for Germany having to pay for everything that was destroyed in World War I. Lastly, the Germans who felt like all of this wasn't their fault ended up blaming certain groups of people, in particular Jewish people and socialists, and they blamed these groups for purposefully losing the war, for not fighting hard enough, or for allowing Allied troops to take over. So the Treaty of Versailles is one of our primary source documents, so please review that carefully. We are just looking at 2 of the articles, namely the ones that blame Germany and lay out the directions for how Germany will pay the reparations in humongous chunks of money to the rest of the European powers. And again, this causes a lot of insult and is hugely humiliating to the German people, who are a proud people who have industrialized and taken over huge areas of the world. And again, those colonies that were taken from them, including parts of China, which Japan goes in to take, which eventually ends up leading China to the Soviets, to the socialist and communist philosophy. All of these things lead to a lot of problems within Germany, and it's up to a kind of very intense philosophy to renew the idea of German strength, and it causes huge problems in the future, as we see with those Jews and the socialists and other groups of people who are blamed for losing World War I. They are punished in the most extraordinary of ways in World War II with the Holocaust. This picture shows some important people, one in particular. The Great War to end all wars that ended in an armistice, a timeout or a pause, led to World War II because people were provoked. On the left side in the front row, there's an X over someone with a mustache that is not recognizable. When he shaved the sides of his mustache, he would become very recognizable and very memorable. That was Adolf Hitler. And he really was ready to go back and fight in World War II, and he did. Another of the major consequences of the Great War, or of the war to end all wars, was the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, which outlined Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. Now, this was part of a speech given to Congress in January of 1918, and it outlined a few important ideas that Wilson, based on a bunch of people who had done research as to what would come in future peace treaties, and these 14 points included to make the world safe for democracy. Now, most or all democratic states might love this idea. However, this was sort of a huge threat to other states who weren't too keen on the idea of democracy, namely what had become the Soviet Union and the several states that became part of the Soviet Union, led mainly by the Russians. And the idea of making the world safe for democracy seemed like a really big slap in the face and a really big threat to those states who did not appreciate the idea of free capitalism and democracy and preferred the idea of socialism or communism. Of course, the Soviet Union turned towards an extreme way after Lenin passed, and Stalin took over. We'll talk about that in coming lectures. Another of the big goals of Wilson's 14 points was free navigation and economic exchange, and this in particular was probably due to the fact that the United States entered the war because of Germans' unrestricted submarine warfare. The Germans decided that all boats going in and around the British harbors were enemy boats, and our American trading boats were threatened by that. And we will see how if people threaten American trade and goods and the economic exchanges and the freedom of economic exchanges, that leads to major problems for people. So that's something to think about and consider. And also free sovereignty. And of course, this was for people who already had power and money. Sovereignty did not include the colonies. And there were still many, many colonies, as we just saw in prior maps. And the colonies of the losers were absorbed by the winners rather than being allowed to become more independent states. Many of the colonies, especially in the Middle East and in Africa and in Asia, were absorbed by the winning states. And supposedly they were to prepare for independence, but it took 10 to 40 years after the end of World War I, and in some cases until after World War II ended, before many states became sovereign entities on their own. And this, of course, included China, which parts of China belonged to Germany before the war, were German colonies. And after the war, they were taken by Japan. And the Western states who were talking about freedom and sovereignty did not defend China in any way. And the only entity to say that imperialism was something that was wrong and should be stopped was the Soviet Union, which was why, a really big reason why China turned towards communism, because that's where they were getting support. And the 14 points are a primary source for us, so read those and learn from them, and we will discuss in our discussion. The view from the colonies, another major consequence of the Great War. People in the colonies are stunned, are shocked by the slaughter that has taken place in Europe. White people fighting against white people, and these are people who are supposed to be enlightened, and they are supposed to be the most advanced in the world, and yet they've just massacred each other in the numbers of up to 20 million people. And so that's kind of shocking. How are these people supposed to be better than us, more enlightened than we are, and yet they just massacred each other for really no reason? Also, the colonies were promised reforms and promised independence, and of course none of this was kept. People who were colonists, like British people, told their Indian counterparts, their colonies, the people who they were controlling in India, for example, that if you come and fight as a soldier in war on our side, when we are done with the war, you will get all sorts of reforms, you will gain equality, you will gain independence, and none of that happened until after World War II, so we're talking another 30 plus years. And then again, the mandates were created. Rather than getting rid of old empires and creating independent states, territories were once again under the control of other European superpowers like the British and French. The sabotage that was conducted during the Great War ended up being a really big challenge for World War II. For example, the German sabotage during World War I led people to freak out over anyone Japanese during World War II because America was at war with Japan. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, which is in Hawaii in the United States. And as soon as that happened, Japanese people or anyone in America of Japanese descent was gathered up and stuck into internment camps, which were uncomfortable, to put it mildly. We'll talk more about this during World War II lecture, but it was just kind of interesting to see how the German sabotage, led to, in an ironic way, the internment of Japanese people in America, which today would be considered by many people as pretty racist. And then the propaganda in World War I, showing those images of those horrible, scary monster Huns, and all of the evil things that were happening. Many of them were true in a lot of ways, but the propaganda of World War I led to less belief in the atrocities that were actually occurring in World War II. A lot of people knew about the Holocaust. It would have been really easy for people to bomb railroad lines to stop the mass movement of people to execution sites, and millions of people could have been saved, but there wasn't really a full belief in what was being told to people in World War II. And some of the historians would say that that's because of propaganda from World War I. A few other of the consequences of the Great War. The Russian Revolution happened in 1917. Germany knew that if Russia went into a revolution, that they would have to pull out of World War I, which is exactly what happened. They brought Lenin back from another European country. It provoked a revolution, the Tsar was deposed, and the first communist state was created, headed by the Bolsheviks, which were communists. And Russia had to pull out of World War I, which was to the benefit of Germany at the time. Japan expanded into German territory, namely in China. Germany had colonies in China, and when Germany lost World War I, Japan went in and took those territories in China. And China looked towards the West and towards those Allied powers and said, hey, we've been sending in Chinese troops to come fight for you and with you. You need to help us out and not allow Japan to take our territory. And the West did nothing. European powers and America did nothing. So China turned towards the Soviet Union, the USSR, for protection against Japan. And of course, that led to China turning towards communism as well. And to today, China is still a communist state. The United States rose in power in a tremendous way after World War I, partly because the United States was sending so many goods over to Europe, to the Allied powers during World War I, and all of that had to be paid for. So the United States came out doing pretty well before even rebuilding Europe. And then the United States helped to rebuild Europe with lots of loans and goods. So the United States made a whole chunk of money and really came out of World War I unscathed. Our territory in the United States was pretty much untouched, especially when you look at what was going on in Europe. So the United States really became a superpower at this time. Eventually, the Great Depression hit, starting in 1929, about 10 years after the end of World War I, but it's all sort of interrelated because the war effort provoked a lot of industry to be created. After the war was over, a lot of industries started to fail, and then the Great Depression happened because people were playing the stock market and there weren't regulations. And just sort of a quick note on minority groups in World War I. We had people of all minority groups, in particular African Americans, serving in World War I for America. And as you can see here, this is an all-black troop, an all-black regiment. There was segregation even in the military, even in war. And I think the worst part about what happened here was when these brave soldiers who had volunteered to fight for America's freedoms and rights came home. When these brave young men came home, they had to deal with extraordinary segregation and racism and Jim Crow laws that lasted many more years until well after World War II. So this is kind of an unfortunate thing that these men experienced. Okay, so just a quick sort of review of the focus question. What were the major far-reaching consequences of World War I in both time and place? In other words, what did World War I affect or cause or do to change the future? And as all focus questions go, we pretty thoroughly answered this in this lecture, in this PowerPoint. And if you have any questions, you know where to reach me. I hope you learned a lot about World War I and enjoyed sort of, it's kind of a depressing topic to discuss, but this is history.